Well, we're nearly 6 months into this dreadful war in Gaza. But Israel and representative of the Hamas terrorist group, they're going to now meet in Egypt on Sunday to talk about truce. Now, this is after the UN Security Council demanded a truce, and after big protests in Israel on the weekend also demanded the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu step down and make way for a truce to release the remaining hostages held by Hamas. Now, like I say, it's nearly 6 months since Hamas did attack Israel, starting this war, killed 1,200 people, raped women, kidnapped more than 250 people. And the war since has devastated Gaza, the Palestinian territory run by Hamas. And despite that, though, I have to say, I doubt much can be hoped for from these talks. Certainly not a long-term peace deal. Not when the leader of Hamas abroad, the leader of Hamas inside Gaza, the big chief, but the leader of Hamas abroad, says he's never going to accept the existence of Israel. And Hamas is encouraged by the mobs in our streets that keep repeating that Hamas chant, from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free.
المسألة الأولى، نحن لا نقبل حل الدولتين. هذا مصطلح مرفوض، لأنه معناه أنك أنت لك دولة موعودة، خاصة بعد 7 أكتوبر. أظن تجدد الحلم والأمل، فلسطين من البحر إلى النهر، من الشمال إلى الجنوب. وهذا حتى كما قلت لك أصبح شعار في الولايات المتحدة وفي العواصم الغربية وعند الجمهور الغربي الأمريكي والغربي.
So congratulations to all those moron protesters in our streets chanting what Hamas is. Well, it's giving them a lot of encouragement. You just heard it from the big boss abroad. Joining me is the country's top foreign affairs writer, Greg Sheridan of the Australian newspaper. These talks in Egypt, Greg, great to see you. These talks in Egypt, are they going to lead to much on Sunday?
Andrew, great to be with you. Look, you might get a 6-week ceasefire. You might. I must say, all the uncritical support people give to what would effectively be a unilateral Israeli ceasefire, such as our government, which I think just wanders in a dark fantasy on these issues, that encourages Hamas not to do a ceasefire involving releasing hostages. Because if the whole world is saying to Israel, you must ceasefire no matter what Hamas does, then Hamas will say to itself, we can get a ceasefire without releasing any hostages. The other point I'd make to you is, Hamas always calculated that Gaza would be devastated by Israel. It did these attacks in precisely the way it did them in order to engineer this response from Israel, and it is perfectly happy for Gazan civilians to suffer grievously. That doesn't mean Israel has no moral obligation to the people of Gaza, but it's not unhappy that this suffering should continue. It thinks Israel's name is being besmirched around the world, and it's making strategic gains. It hopes it'll get a new front out of Lebanon. So it's not under much pressure to produce a ceasefire. Well, to pick up your point, you're quite correct that the world seems to always, with these breakthroughs, to demand more of Israel than Hamas. It's like, let's pick on the guy that's reasonable and might do something rather than the murderers over there. Example, the UN Security Council says ceasefire now, right? What people forget is that part of what it demanded was also the immediate release of the hostages. They just say, well, Israel, you should ceasefire now. What about the hostages? That's right. If you are sincere about this, you have to say the hostages must be released and then we'll have a ceasefire. And if Hamas won't release the hostages, therefore, you're not putting demand on Israel to have a ceasefire. But what the UN is saying and what the Albanese government is saying, and I think their performance on this has really been very, very poor, they are saying that Israel must have a ceasefire no matter what Hamas does. So what happens then? The day after the ceasefire is announced, Hamas continues to fire rockets at Israeli towns and continues to shoot at Israeli soldiers. If the Israeli soldiers shoot back, they're in breach of the ceasefire, and you just spiral into, more violence, but without an effective Israeli military operation running it. The whole of the international commentary is really a kind of, a term I don't much use. It's really a sort of virtue signalling. It's a kind of a performative thing. Certainly that's true of all of Australia's comments. I mean, in the paper tomorrow, I go through a bit the Albanese government's comments on this, and they are just absurd. They're full of contradictions. Like Albanese demands a two-state solution straight away. Hamas has just said in that package, we've got no interest in a two-state solution. And Albanese has said Hamas must not have any role in the future governance of Gaza. But if Israel stops tomorrow, Hamas comes back and reestablishes its control.
Have they not read the polls in the West Bank and Gaza that say Hamas is the most popular? I mean, they would win, if not through the ballot box, they'd shoot their way to victory like they did in Gaza. They'd take over militarily. I mean, it's just so absurd. It's like we're judging Hamas like, oh, they're just reasonable people. Look, they've got a nice jacket on. We can talk sense. No, they were operating on a total different moral plane. US President Joe Biden, though, started this war, very strong pro-Israel, now is putting huge heat on the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. He refused to block that UN Security Council call. He could have, he had the veto vote. What's going on there?
Well, I think Biden is essentially pro-Israel, but is basically very weak, and he's under a lot of political pressure. I mean, the West has seen massive Muslim immigration to all Western nations, and they are now a factor in domestic politics. So Biden is being pressured by the big Arab vote in Michigan, which is a state that he must win if he's going to win in November. At the same time, the US has announced another $2.5 billion in military equipment for Israel, another squadron of F-35 jets and bombs and so forth. So Biden is talking out of both sides of his mouth at once, like a lot of politicians always do. I do think Netanyahu is now past his use-by date. I don't think he's the villain of all worlds, but I think he's not. His presence there doesn't help Israel. How you can get rid of him? I mean, Golda Meir resigned as a result of the Yom Kippur War, and I think Benjamin Netanyahu should resign as a result of this.
Look, that's absolutely correct. But people fantasising that then the war against Gaza will be conducted differently, forget it. I mean, I don't see much change in that at all. Whoever's the Prime Minister. Just quickly, United Nations mentioned them, Security Council. How corrupt is this body? Because it's just, last week, it's just given this man, the representative of Saudi Arabia, it's made him its new chairman of, get this, the UN Commission on the Status of Women, Saudi Arabian man. Meanwhile, China sits on the UN Human Rights Council, and Iran was 2 weeks ago made chairman of the UN Conference on Disarmament despite its unlawful, illegal nuclear weapons program. I mean, seriously.
Well, you know, Andrew, you say seriously, but you've got to admire the way the United Nations scripts itself like an evil and war satire. It's just true. You couldn't make it up. Saudi Arabia to head the women's rights. I mean, it's just a joke. And the idea that the United Nations, it's a significant body, you've got to take it seriously, but the idea that it has any moral weight, that it should govern something Australia does in our politics because of its moral weight, with all those appointments you just detailed, Iran, head of arms control. I mean, it's beyond parody. You know, Malcolm Muggeridge satirised the League of Nations brilliantly a generation before that, but this is sort of beyond parody.
This is beyond parody. People have got to wake up about what the United Nations really is. I mean, it's now increasingly dominated by China, Russia, people that don't really believe in our values, Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's just a nightmare.